There is a story that most people do not know. A story that happened not in ancient Europe, not in the dark castles of Transylvania, but right here in America, in small quiet towns, in ordinary families, in graveyards that still exist today. The legend of the vampire did not start with Dracula. It did not start with Hollywood movies or television shows. It started with real people, real deaths, real fear, and real communities who dug up their own dead and did things to the bodies that would make your skin crawl. This is not a fairy tale. This is not fiction. This is the dark and forgotten history of how vampire legends were born in America. And once you hear it, you will never look at a graveyard the same way again. To understand how vampire legends started in America, we have to go back to the 1700s and 1800s. This was a time before modern medicine, a time when people had no understanding of how diseases spread, no antibiotics, no hospitals with proper care, no doctors who could explain why one person in the family would get sick and die, and then another, and then another, and then another. One by one, the members of a single family would fall ill with the same mysterious symptoms. They would grow pale. They would lose weight rapidly. They would cough up blood. They would waste away slowly and painfully until they died. And the community watching this happen had no scientific explanation for what they were seeing. So they turned to the only explanation that made sense to them. Something supernatural was feeding on this family. Something was draining their life force. Something was coming back from the dead. The disease that was actually killing these families had a name. We know it today as tuberculosis. In the 1800s, Americans called it consumption, and they called it that for a very specific reason, because it looked like something was consuming the person from the inside out. The symptoms were terrifying to witness. The sick person would grow thinner and thinner every day. Their skin would turn pale, almost translucent. Their eyes would sink deep into their skull. They would sweat heavily at night. They would cough violently, sometimes bringing up blood. And through all of this, they would sometimes have moments of strange energy and brightness that made them seem almost supernaturally alive, even as they were clearly dying. To a family with no medical knowledge watching their loved one go through this, it was absolutely terrifying. And when that person died, and then someone else in the family started showing the exact same symptoms, the fear turned into something much darker. The belief that spread through these small American communities was deeply disturbing. They believed that when a person died of consumption, they did not truly rest in peace. They believed that the dead person was rising from their grave at night and returning to their family home, feeding on the life force of their living relatives, draining them slowly, passing the sickness from one family member to the next like a curse that could not be stopped. And the only way to stop it was to go to the graveyard, dig up the body of the dead person, and perform a ritual that would finally put them to rest for good. What happened next in those graveyards in the dead of night is one of the darkest and most disturbing chapters in American history. The families would gather at night, sometimes with the help of the local community, sometimes with the reluctant presence of a doctor or town official who had been begged to attend. They would dig up the grave of the recently deceased family member. And when they opened the coffin, what they saw inside confirmed all of their worst fears. The body did not look like a normal decomposed corpse. Instead, it looked unnervingly preserved. The cheeks were flushed with color. The lips were red. There was what appeared to be fresh blood around the mouth. The body looked almost alive. To the terrified family standing around that open grave in the middle of the night, this was proof. This was undeniable evidence that their dead relative was indeed a vampire, rising at night, feeding on the living. What they did not know was that what they were seeing was a completely normal part of the decomposition process. Modern science has since explained exactly what those families were seeing when they opened those graves. As a body decomposes, gases build up inside it. These gases cause the body to bloat and expand. They push fluid up through the throat and out of the mouth, creating what looks like fresh blood on the lips. They cause the skin to appear flushed and full of color. They can even cause the body to shift position inside the coffin, making it appear as if the dead person has been moving. In the cold New England winters where many of these cases occur, the ground was often frozen, which slowed decomposition even further, making the bodies look even more preserved and lifelike. than they would have otherwise. Every single thing those terrified families saw in those open graves had a perfectly rational scientific explanation. But in the 1800s, that science did not exist. And so the rituals continued. The rituals performed on these exhumed bodies were deeply disturbing. The most common ritual involved removing the heart from the body. The family believed that the heart of the vampire was the source of its power. That as long as the heart remained intact, the dead person could continue to rise and feed on the living. So they would cut open the chest of the corpse, remove the heart, and then burn it. Sometimes they would make the sick family members inhale the smoke from the burning heart, believing that this would cure them of the sickness the vampire had given them. In other cases, they would turn the body face down in the coffin, believing that if the vampire tried to claw its way out, it would dig deeper into the earth instead of upward. Sometimes they would cut off the head and place it between the legs of the corpse. These were not the acts of evil people. These were the acts of terrified people desperately trying to save their families from something they did not understand. The most famous case of American vampire panic happened in a small town in Rhode Island. The town was called Exeter, and the family at the center of the story was called the Brown family. In the late 1800s, the Brown family began to die one by one. First, the mother Mary Brown died of consumption. Then the eldest daughter, Mary Olive, died of the same disease. Then the son, Edwin, became terribly ill. And then the youngest daughter, Mercy Brown, fell sick and died in January 1892. By this point, the community of Exeter was convinced that something supernatural was happening to the Brown family. They went to the father, George Brown, and told him what needed to be done. The bodies of his dead wife and daughters needed to be exhumed. And if any of them showed signs of being a vampire, the ritual needed to be performed immediately. On March 17th, 1892, a group of men gathered at the Chestnut Hill Cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island. George Brown, the grieving father, stood among them. A doctor had been brought along to make the examination official. They dug up the bodies of Mary Brown and Mary Olive first. Both bodies had decomposed normally and were dismissed as not being vampires. Then they opened the grave of the youngest daughter, Mercy Brown. She had only been dead for 2 months, and the winter ground had kept her body remarkably preserved. When they opened her coffin, the men gathered around it gasped. Mercy's body showed almost no decomposition. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips were red, and when they cut open her chest, they found that her heart still contained liquid blood. To every man standing around, that open grave, the evidence was absolutely conclusive. Mercy Brown was a vampire. They removed Mercy Brown's heart from her body. They built a fire right there in the cemetery, and they burned it. Then they took the ashes of the burned heart and mixed them with water. And they brought that mixture back to the Brown family home, where Mercy's sick brother Edwin was lying in bed, barely clinging to life. They made Edwin drink the mixture of his dead sister's burned heart, believing that this would break the vampire's curse and cure him of his illness. Edwin Brown died 2 months later. The consumption that was killing him had nothing to do with his dead sister. It was a bacterial infection spreading through his lungs that no ritual could cure. But the story of Mercy Brown did not end with Edwin's death. It went on to influence one of the most famous works of fiction in history. Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, published his famous novel in 1897, just 5 years after the Mercy Brown case made international headlines. Historians and literary scholars have since found evidence that Stoker was aware of the American vampire panics, and specifically the Mercy Brown case when he was writing Dracula. The character of Lucy Westenra in the novel bears striking similarities to Mercy Brown, a young woman who dies mysteriously and is then suspected of rising from the dead to prey on the living. The rituals performed on Lucy in the novel mirror the rituals performed on Mercy and other alleged American vampires. What began as the desperate and tragic actions of terrified New England farming families trying to understand a disease they could not explain ended up inspiring the most famous vampire story ever written and shaping the entire modern mythology of the vampire that we know today. But Mercy Brown was not the only American vampire case. Far from it. Researchers have documented dozens of similar cases across New England throughout the 1700s and 1800s. In Connecticut, a man named John Barber was exhumed in 1784, and his heart was burned after his family began dying of consumption one by one. In Vermont, a family called the Corwin family performed similar rituals on their dead relatives in the early 1800s. In Plymouth, Massachusetts, several bodies were exhumed and mutilated in vampire rituals throughout the 1800s. These were not isolated incidents of madness. This was a widespread cultural response to the terror of consumption spreading through close-knit rural communities with no access to modern medicine and no scientific framework to explain what was happening to them. What makes the American vampire panic so fascinating and so heartbreaking is the humanity at the center of it. These were not ignorant or evil people. They were farmers and merchants and school teachers and parents. They were people who loved their families desperately and were watching them die one by one with absolutely no way to stop it. The vampire belief gave them something that medicine could not give them at that time. It gave them an explanation. It gave them someone to blame. And most importantly, it gave them something to do. A ritual, an action, a way of fighting back against the invisible force that was destroying their families. The tragedy is that the rituals they performed on their own dead relatives not only failed to save the sick, but caused enormous additional suffering to families who were already devastated by grief. The last documented case of vampire panic in America occurred in 1892 with Mercy Brown. After that, modern medicine began to make rapid advances. The tuberculosis bacterium had been identified by a German scientist named Robert Koch in 1882. By the early 1900s, sanatoriums were being built across America specifically to treat tuberculosis patients. And by 1943, an antibiotic called streptomycin was discovered that could actually cure the disease. The monster that had terrorized New England families for over a century and driven them to dig up their own dead in the middle of the night finally had a name. And eventually it had a cure. But the legend it left behind never died. It transformed. It evolved. It found its way into Bram Stoker's novel, and from there into movies and television shows and comic books and every corner of modern popular culture. What I want you to take away from this story is not just the dark and disturbing details of what happened in those New England graveyards. I want you to think about what it really means. Every monster in human history has an origin. Every legend begins somewhere. And that somewhere is almost always rooted in real human suffering and real human fear. The vampire legend was not born in the imagination of a novelist. It was born in the grief of a father watching his children die. It was born in the terror of a community watching a disease they could not understand or stop spread from family to family like a curse. It was born in the desperate and heartbreaking actions of ordinary people trying to protect the ones they loved with the only tools they had available to them. The vampire was never a monster from another world. The vampire was always us, trying to make sense of death in a world that gave us no answers. The grave of Mercy Brown still exists today. It sits in the Chestnut Hills Cemetery in Exeter, Rhode Island. People visit it from all over the world. They leave flowers and trinkets and notes. Some come out of morbid curiosity. Some come out of genuine respect for a young woman whose death became one of the most famous chapters in American folklore. Mercy Brown was not a vampire. She was an 18-year-old girl who died of tuberculosis in January 1892. She deserved to rest in peace. Instead, her grave was dug up, her heart was cut out and burned, and her ashes were fed to her dying brother. And her story went on to inspire Dracula and shape the entire modern mythology of the vampire. She deserved better. They all deserve better. If this story gave you chills, leave a comment below and tell me what you think. And if you're new here, subscribe to Stories Never Told. Every single week, I bring you the stories that history forgot, the ones that will make you see the world differently. I will see you in the next one.